The material that you're about to listen to and engage with came from our 2017 Missiology Lectures, when myself, along with my colleague Johnny Ramirez Johnson, said we need to do this next 2017 Missiology Lectures on this topic of race, theology, and mission. And we invited Dr. Love Sechrest to engage with us in that process. We wanted to explore the challenging questions regarding racism and ethnocentrism and xenophobia and all of those issues from the perspective of world Christianity with regard to how these realities have existed in many parts of the world, and also as part of the colonial mission endeavors.
It is fascinating to think that the realities we were talking about are not the experiences of one individual or even one society. We're talking about whiteness as a way of defining the world. And the conference and the conference presenters address time and again this epistemology, this way of making meaning. It has also been described as colonization and post-colonization. The question is not about guilt, it's about engagement. It's about what are we going to do with what we have inherited. So the fact that we're having the conversation should not point a finger at you as a listener or viewer.
But these are hard conversations. The conversation about race is one that has been deferred for so long and so often, over and over again. As soon as we get close to having a meaningful conversation about race, we recoil from the pain of it. And so in our lectures, you'll see some of that pain emerge. You'll see some people who have long experienced racism express and declare and name experiences that they have had that have been deeply formative, deformative even. So this conversation is not a pretty one, but we're having it.
As observers, as listeners, you will be engaging, and we invite you to invite the Holy Spirit. The three of us pray a lot about this series. We humbly submitted to God and pleaded for God's mercy to lead us. We are feeble, and combined, we are imperfect, and we have prayed that the Lord will fill the gaps. And the conversation is only a starter. It is in your hands. It is in your community. It is in your family. And most importantly, it is on your knees.
Let me first begin by saying how much of an honor it is to respond to Dr. Akintune's paper. Some of you may know, but he's well respected around this country as an African scholar, and also around the UK. But also he's seen as a mentor for established and emerging scholars across Africa, and so it's a real privilege to respond to him. And I also use his works for a number of my own projects. The issue of race and mission in Africa as an area of study is relatively new, a new phenomenon. Missiology in Africa in the post-colonial era has focused primarily on indigenization and contextualization. And by the way, I'm responding to his paper, not just giving my own ideas. And in the case of maybe next year I'll graduate to being the main speaker, but right now let me just take my 15 minutes of fame, right? So the issue of race in Africa as an area of study is relatively a recent phenomenon. Missiology in Africa and in post-colonial era has focused primarily on indigenization, contextualization, and in the case of South Africa or Southern Africa, liberation. How race and racialization has shaped the Western missionary projects in Africa and continues to impact African theological imagination has not been given the attention it really deserves within the era of post-colonial mission studies and missiology. And so Dr. Akinade has spent many years studying the intersection of African religions, Islam, and Christianity within a post-colonial context, and therefore brings great insight to the issue of race, religion, and mission in Africa. Conversations about race in America is so urgent and so intense that it's easy to zone out when race is discussed in other spaces and contexts. Nevertheless, understanding how racism and racialization has morphed and enshrined itself in different cultural spaces is also very important for the American context and debate. And so in the paper, Ambivalent Modalities, Mission and Race in the African Context, Dr. Akinade situates mission and race within what he calls key developments, events, and circumstances in African Christian mission history. He argues that the linkage between mission and race are deeply embedded in the litany of events and responses to specific historical moments in African Christianity. The moments and events he identifies are critical ones in making of the post-colonial African Christianity. He identifies essentially two of them. Let me just read that again. The moments and events he identifies are critical ones in the making of post-colonial African Christianity. He identifies two of them, namely the story of A.J. Crowther, as we heard, and the moratorium debate. And he concludes the paper by proposing a non-bourgeois missiology as an extension of Joseph Dunder's non-bourgeois theology. I would like to respond to these three main moments or events. But first, I would like to say something about what appears to be a heuristic methodology or methodological approach to engage in mission and race in Africa. A heuristic methodology certainly has its advantages. I think narratives and stories, particularly in an African context, and now even within a postmodern mindset in the West, really looms large. Heuristic research, which prioritizes discovery of meanings and essence of significance human experience, certainly helps to tell the story of mission and race in Africa. So in this respect, the focus on developments, events, and circumstances are useful categories for teasing out the implications of race matters for missions and vice versa, as Dr. Akinade mentions. I did ponder, nonetheless, whether beginning with the consequence or the corollary of race or of racial missionary imagination deprived us of the opportunity of deconstructing the Western missionaries' racialized imagination and epistemology itself. Rather than beginning with Crowther, perhaps a theological inquiry on how Christian soteriology became racialized in the minds of the Enlightenment missionaries might have provided a deeper appreciation of Crowther's resistance. In a discussion about mission and race in Africa, I would be inclined to use as a starting point the Enlightenment imagination in manners that Willie Jennings talks about Jose de Costa and Cameron Carter talks about Immanuel Kant. Moving on to the first event highlighted by Dr. Akinade, the story and legends and legacy of Bishop Crowther, as he so eloquently points out, indeed provides a compelling vantage point for engaging the dynamics of mission and race in African Christianity. Crowther's rise from slave to student and then on to becoming the bishop and head of the Niger mission is most remarkable. Crowther's faith, courage, resolve in the face of humiliation and sabotage by racist CMS missionaries cements him as a critical figure in the saga of race, foreign missions, and indigenous church in Africa. Dr. Akinde's proposition that Bishop Crowther marks the tipping point in the complex relationship between foreign missionary agents and indigenous church might, however, be contested in the courtroom of African Christian history. For example, might a heuristic moment of the Zulu Unzul and the Unsakana during the Zulu War with the British in 1811 and 1819 be worthy to being described as a tipping point also? The Xhosa Christian prophets Unzul and Unsikana in their various ways resisted the British colonizers and missionaries with liberating message that fused Xhosa traditional religion and Dutch Christian theology. This was indeed an early example of indigenous Christian resistance against a colonizing and missionizing agency. Or perhaps the heroic story of the black woman known as Kimpa Vita. Anybody heard of her? AKA Donna Beatrice. Kimpa Vita, who at the beginning of the 18th century challenged the formalism of the Roman Catholic Church in the Portuguese kingdom of the Congo. She attempted to enculturate Christianity in an African context by leading a protest against colonial rule and identification with African nationalism. She provided the concept of a black Christ who identified with black exploited Africans. Other possible tipping points could include protests and renewal movement that arose out of Southern Africa, such as the Mansopi Makita movement in Lesotho, also the Hendrik Witbooi, a type of political messiah amongst the Herero in Southwest Africa, or even Enoch Gijima in South Africa, could also provide a tipping point, which prepared the way for the 19th century emergence of the development of what is known as Ethiopianism in the broader context of Pan-Africanism. And let's not forget, because I know that Dr. Akintunde is a Nigerian, and there's a saying in Africa, when Nigeria sneezes, the whole of Africa catches a cold. And so this proposition that Bishop Crowther is a tipping point, I'm speaking on the rest of Africa who want to challenge that notion. Let us not forget also the powerful stories surrounding African prophets such as William Wadi Harris, a crew from Liberia, or Walter Matifa, prophets such from Lesotho, or even Simon, this is the East African friends are chiming in, Simon Kimbangu. And being someone who's lived in Ghana for 10 years, let me also mention Samson Opon from the former Gold Coast. Also mark the tipping points between Africa and the Western missionary agencies. And so while the towering figure of Samuel Crowther and the story surrounding its place in African Christianity or African Christian history is possibly unrivaled, might a centripetal as opposed to a centrifugal approach be better served. And this centripetal approach will avoid any regional Nigerianization and national hagiography. The issue of moratorium on white missionary to Africa sparked a very important debate in Africa. Once John Gattu issued the moratorium, it took on a life of its own, and because it struck numerous chords relating to the collapse of colonialism and the concomitant missionary agency. The moratorium became a form of resistance in a manner not too dissimilar to the bus boycott sparked by Rosa Parks. Leaders across Africa have said in a unified voice, we do not want any more white missionaries. We do not want any more white, Western, enlightenment peddling, racist missionaries coming here. Keep your money, Keep your benefits, keep your schools, keep your education. Moratorium, embargo, suspension, cease, resistance. And while you were speaking, I was wondering what would happen if we had such a moratorium in this country. A moratorium against pastors who enjoyed the kaleidoscope of multicultural churches but are indifferent to black and brown members, fight for social justice and equal opportunities. Go home. A moratorium against professors who teach as though all of the biblical world was a stage, a big white stage. Go home. A moratorium against black and brown leaders who specify or pacify the pain of black suffering, but do not provide prophetic and courageous leadership in the fight against injustice and white supremacy. You also go home. Yeah, I even go further at the risk of losing my job and say a moratorium against white evangelical schools that love the black Benjamins but ate black bodies and black life. Hit the road, Jack. Don't you come back no more. But I digress. A part of this new independence, which arose out of the same time as the moratorium issue by John Gatto, was the rise of African Pentecostal movement on the shoulders of African indigenous churches and African propheticism. And I noticed that wasn't included. But I think it deserves the space here, Doc. Although the fresh wave of African Christian renewal is usually overlooked in conversations about race, I believe it has a prominent place. African Pentecostalism is a contemporary African renewal movement that must be placed within the post-colonial quest for African Christian identity against the background of colonial imagination. In the final section, Dr. Akinade's paper, he posits a non-bourgeois missiology, an extension of what I said, John Donder's non-bourgeois theology. This non-bourgeois missiology is centered on the concept of the missio Dei and is based on the incarnational model of mission. So just two friendly parting suggestions. Might an expression missio spiritus as opposed to missio Dei better serve as a dynamic concept of African missiology, given Africa's pneumatic Christian predilection and epistemology? So say missiological approach could be grounded in Acts 2 with Pentecost and the birth of the new church, and Acts 13 where the Bible talks about the spirits which separates Paul and Barnabas, and other texts that links the spirit and mission. The idea of the missio spiritus could be aided by the works of people like even Roland Allen in his ministry of the Spirit, and a colleague of mine, Andrew Lord, Spirit-Shaped Mission, and Julie and Wansuk Mars' work on mission in theology, mission in the Spirit, and even our very own Amos Young's missiological spirit. Lastly, the concept of a non-bourgeois missiology is very compelling, but I wondered whether a more indigenized African concept, such as Ubuntu, might better communicate the essence of an African missiology as opposed to the European idea of bourgeoisie. Would an Ubuntu missiology capture the spirit of and philosophical foundation of African mission? Ubuntu is an underlying vision of or worldview enshrined in the Zulu maxim, and I quote, "A person is a person through other persons." The essence of this African aphorism is the basic respect and compassion for others. It asserts our ability to coexist goes to the very core of our humanity. Speaking of Ubuntu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, "A person with Ubuntu," and I quote, "a person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened and that others are able and good. For he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed." End of quote. If one was to go with this idea of a bourgeois missiology for Africa, might I suggest that it should respond to critical existential questions facing Africa today? And so I would ask, how might a non-bourgeois missiology confront the global structures of racism through Western agencies, which I call principalities and powers, like the IMF, the World Bank, and other global forces that seek to keep Africa in a perpetual state of underdevelopment? How might it speak to the new imperial powers coming from China and India, particularly that is perpetuating poverty and undercutting and undermining local African economies? How might this non-bourgeois theology and missiology address Muslim, and this is the area I know you have much expertise, Muslim-Christian conflict in Africa, especially militant streams such as the jihadist movement and of Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Boko Haram? And lastly, how might a non-bourgeois missiology respond to the issues of poverty and global migration and displacement? God bless you. Thank you.